3 weeks after my granddaughter's 6th birthday party, my phone rang at 8 in the morning. The event coordinator's voice was shaking. "Sir, I need you to come to my office. Please come alone and don't tell your daughter." 22 minutes later, I sat across from her as she opened a laptop and played the raw video filmed that night. At first there was only laughter, warm lights, and the moment my granddaughter blew out her candles. Then the camera slowly moved toward the second-floor hallway. And that was when I heard my son-in-law say something that made the room go cold. "I am so grateful you chose to spend your time here. Tell me in the comments, what part of the world are you joining from? Your country, your city, let me know." Note some elements of this story are fictional, added to enrich the narrative and its lessons. Any similarity to existing names or locations is coincidental. The meaning behind it, however, is something I hope stays with you. My name is Conrad Whitfield. I am 60 years old, and I have spent the better part of 4 decades building things meant to last: bridges, highways, structural foundations across the state of Idaho. I founded Sterling Construction in 1989 with $40,000, a second-hand pickup truck, and a stubbornness that my late wife, Margaret, always said was either my greatest strength or my most exhausting quality, depending on the day she was asked. I retired from day-to-day operations 2 years ago and handed the company to my daughter, Natalie. She was ready. She had been ready for years, and if I am being honest with myself, the way engineers are trained to be honest with data, not sentiment, I had been holding on longer than I should have, simply because Sterling was the last thing Margaret and I had built together before she got sick. But this story is not about Sterling Construction. Not entirely. It begins on the evening of Saturday, June 15th, 2024, in the living room of my home at 3847 Warm Springs Avenue, Boise, Idaho. We were celebrating the 6th birthday of my granddaughter, Lily. The house was full in a way it had not been since Margaret's funeral, which is a strange thing to notice at a child's birthday party. But I noticed it because I am the kind of man who notices things and writes them down. 80 guests moved through the rooms: city council members, contractors, 2 state senators, and a handful of Sterling's board members, including Harlan Voss, who had been my closest friend on the board for 30 years, and who arrived early, as he always did, with a bottle of good bourbon and that wide, easy smile of his. "Conrad." Harlan clapped me on the shoulder the moment he found me standing near the fireplace. He was 64, silver-haired, built like a man who had played football in college and never entirely stopped. "You look like a man who just realized everything turned out all right." "Maybe I did," I told him. He lifted his glass toward the center of the room where Brennan Holt, my son-in-law, 32 years old, senior financial advisor at a firm called Callaway and Reed on West Jefferson Street, was crouching down to eye level with Lily, letting her put a paper birthday crown on his head without a word of complaint. Around him, 3 different conversations were happening simultaneously, and Brennan moved through all of them with the ease of a man who had never once felt out of place in his life. "That boy is good," Harlan said. "You chose well, Conrad." I watched Brennan straighten up, crown still on his head, and say something to Natalie that made her laugh, that full, unguarded laugh she had inherited from her mother. My chest did something complicated that I did not have a name for. It was the closest thing to peace I had felt in 3 years. Natalie Whitfield. My daughter was 34 years old and currently the CEO of the company I had spent my life building. She wore a deep blue dress that Margaret would have approved of, and she moved through the party with the same quiet authority she brought to every board meeting, noticing things, adjusting things, making everyone around her feel attended to without ever appearing to try. She was the best of both of us, Margaret and me, assembled in a way that still surprised me sometimes. Lily, for her part, was operating at full 6-year-old capacity. She had already eaten 2 pieces of cake, convinced her grandfather to carry her on his shoulders for approximately 4 minutes before his knees registered a formal complaint, and was currently attempting to teach Gilbert Holt, Brennan's father, a retired high school principal, from Coeur d'Alene, the correct way to play a card game she had invented herself, the rules of which changed every 30 seconds. Gilbert was a gentle, patient man with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, and the permanent expression of someone who found the world mostly amusing. His wife Loretta stood beside him, with her hand on his arm, watching her son across the room, with the particular pride of a mother who believes she is responsible for everything good her child has ever done. I had no reason that evening to feel anything but warmth toward either of them. Patrick Odom arrived at 7 o'clock with a hard case for his gimbal camera, and the quiet, professional efficiency of someone who had documented 200 events and knew how to become invisible. He was 35, freelance recommended by Meredith Cole, the event coordinator Natalie had hired for the evening. I shook his hand at the door, told him we wanted something natural rather than staged, and promptly forgot he was there. That was, I would later understand, precisely what made him so good at his job. The evening moved the way good evenings move, without effort, without friction, one moment folding into the next. Lily blew out her candles, and the room cheered. Brennan gave a toast that was funny and genuine, and ended with him looking at Natalie in a way that made two of the women nearby reach for their glasses at the same time. I gave my own toast near 10 o'clock, shorter than Brennan's, with less charm and more sincerity, the way engineers speak when they are asked to say something important. I talked about Margaret. I talked about what it meant to build something that outlasts you. I looked at Natalie when I said it, and she pressed her lips together in the way she does when she is keeping her composure by sheer discipline. And I looked at Brennan, and he met my eyes and nodded once slowly. And I genuinely thought, here is a man who understands what I am saying. By 11 o'clock, the guests had thinned. I helped carry some of the dessert trays to the kitchen, said goodbye to Harlan at the door, watched Gilbert and Loretta's rental car pull out of the driveway. Natalie found me in the hallway and hugged me the way she has hugged me since she was small, arms all the way around, chin on my shoulder. "Good night, Dad," she said. "Good night, sweetheart." She and Brennan left with Lily asleep on Brennan's shoulder, one small arm dangling the paper birthday crown crushed between them. I stood at the front door and watched their car disappear down Warm Springs Avenue. Then I went inside, turned off the porch light, and went to bed feeling for the first time in a long time that the world was exactly the right size. I did not know, as I closed my eyes that night, that Patrick Odom had not yet turned off his camera when he stepped out of the main room and moved toward the hallway on the second floor. What I am about to tell you, I did not witness myself. I want to be clear about that from the beginning, because I am an engineer, and engineers do not present second-hand information as first-hand observation. What I am going to describe is what I saw on a laptop screen 3 weeks later in a converted warehouse office on Americana Boulevard, while a woman named Meredith Cole sat across from me with her hands folded on the table, and her eyes fixed somewhere slightly to the left of my face because she could not quite bring herself to watch me watch it. The timestamp on the footage read 9:34 p.m., June 15th. Patrick Odom's gimbal camera was still running when he stepped into the second-floor hallway of my home. He was moving between rooms, transitioning from the main event space toward the guest corridor, and the camera was rolling, because Patrick was the kind of professional who kept the camera rolling until he was absolutely certain he had everything he needed. It was under most circumstances exactly the quality you want in a videographer. The hallway on the second floor of my house is narrow, 12 feet long, cream-colored walls, a single sconce light near the linen closet that throws a warm, amber glow across the hardwood floor. From the foyer below, you could still hear the faint pulse of music from the party. Up here, it was quiet enough that the gimbal's built-in directional microphone, the kind designed to capture ambient sound with precision, could pick up a conversation spoken barely above a whisper. Two figures stepped into frame from the direction of the guest bedroom. The first was Brennan Holt. Navy suit, white shirt open at the collar, the paper birthday crown Lily had placed on his head long since discarded. He moved with the casual confidence of a man who believed himself to be completely alone. The second figure, I did not recognize her immediately when Meredith first played the footage. She was turned slightly away from the camera, dark hair, black dress, one hand resting against the wall. It was only when Meredith paused the video and zoomed in that I recognized her face. Celeste Pryor, 29 years old. Personal assistant to my daughter Natalie at Sterling Construction. A woman I had seen a dozen times in the hallways of the office who had brought coffee into board meetings, who had smiled at me in the elevator and asked about my weekend. A woman my daughter trusted completely. On the screen, Brennan leaned toward her. His hand moved to her waist, not the incidental brush of two people standing close in a narrow space, but the deliberate, practiced touch of two people who had been here before. Celeste turned toward him, and something in her posture changed, a loosening, a familiarity that made my stomach drop straight through the floor. Then Brennan spoke. The directional microphone caught every word. After the July meeting, he said, his voice low and unhurried, the voice of a man making a grocery list rather than dismantling a family. The old man won't have any authority left. Natalie already signed. She just doesn't know what she signed yet. Celeste's response came quickly, and there was something in her tone, not excitement, not satisfaction, but a tightness, a worry she was trying to keep out of her voice. And the little girl? Brennan's answer arrived without a pause, without a flicker of hesitation, in the same calm, conversational register he used when he called me sir at the dinner table. Lily is my insurance policy. 18 seconds. That was the length of the clip. Meredith closed the laptop. My hands were pressing flat against the surface of the reclaimed wood conference table. I had placed them there at some point during the footage, without registering that I had done it the way your body sometimes makes decisions your mind is still catching up to. I could feel the grain of the wood under my palms. I focused on that. The texture. The weight of my hands. Mr. Whitfield. Meredith's voice was careful, the way a person speaks near something fragile. I need you to know that Patrick has not reviewed this segment. He delivers the full raw files and moves immediately to his next job. I caught this during my standard review, and I have not shared it with anyone. I looked up at her. Her eyes were red at the corners. She had been crying before I arrived, I realized. She had sat alone in this office with what she had found, and she had cried about it, and then she had straightened up and called me. You called me first, I said. My voice came out steadier than I had any right to expect. You're her father, Meredith said. This was your event. You deserved to know before anyone else did. She reached across the table and pushed a small external drive toward me. She had made a copy date-stamped unedited and pushed the drive across the table before I could ask for it. I picked up the drive. It was lighter than it should have been given what it contained. Has anyone else been in this office since you found this? No one? Keep it that way. I stood, and my knees registered a brief, sharp protest, the same knees that had carried Lily on my shoulders 3 weeks ago. Meredith, what you did this morning took courage. I want you to know that I understand that. Her chin trembled. She pressed her lips together hard and nodded, and I could see her fighting the same battle Natalie fights when she refuses to cry in front of people. Jaw tight, eyes bright, every muscle in her face working against itself. I walked out of the brickyard and into the July morning, and the sunlight on Americana Boulevard hit me like something physical. The drive was in my jacket pocket. The temperature was 91 degrees. Somewhere across the city, Brennan Holt was at his desk at Callaway and Reed, or having lunch with a client, or texting my daughter something affectionate. And he had absolutely no idea that 18 seconds of footage existed on a small external drive currently riding in the breast pocket of a 60-year-old retired engineer who had spent his entire career learning how to find the exact point where a structure begins to fail. I got into my car. I did not start the engine. I sat in the parking lot of the brickyard with both hands on the steering wheel and stared at the dashboard and felt the rage move through me, not hot, not loud, but cold and deliberate, like water finding its way through concrete, patient and unstoppable, and absolutely certain of where it was going. Then I started the car and drove home. The morning of Monday, July 7th, began the way most Monday mornings in Boise begin. In the summer, bright and dry and already warm before 8 o'clock, the foothills turning that particular shade of gold that makes you understand why people choose to live here and never leave. I was half a mile east of the Americana Bridge on the Boise Greenbelt, coffee in my left hand, moving at the unhurried pace of a man with nowhere urgent to be. Retirement had given me mornings like this one, and I had learned slowly, and with some resistance, to accept them as the gift they were, rather than the absence of purpose they sometimes felt like. My phone rang at 8:12. The number was local, but unfamiliar. I answered it the way I answered every unknown number during 35 years of managing infrastructure projects, on the second ring without hesitation, because in my experience, the calls you almost don't pick up are usually the ones that matter. Mr. Whitfield. The voice on the other end was one I recognized immediately. Meredith Cole, the event coordinator Natalie had hired for Lily's birthday party 3 weeks ago. But something in the way she said my name stopped me mid-stride. It was not the warm, organized professionalism I remembered from our planning meetings. This was quieter, more careful. The voice of someone who had been rehearsing this phone call for several days and still was not sure she was ready to make it. Meredith. I stepped off the main path onto the grass, away from a pair of cyclists coming up behind me. Good morning. Is everything all right? A pause stretched out between us, not long, maybe 2 seconds. But 2 seconds is a very long time when you are waiting for someone to answer that question. Mr. Whitfield, I need to show you something, she said. Something that Patrick captured on the night of the party. I need you to come to my office. Another pause. Please come alone. Don't bring Natalie. Not yet. My hand tightened around the coffee cup. The greenbelt stretched out ahead of me, empty and sun-dappled, and suddenly very far away from where I needed to be. Meredith, I said, and I kept my voice level the way you keep a measuring instrument level deliberately with effort, because everything depends on the reading being accurate. Can you give me any indication of what we're talking about? I would rather show you in person, she said. I want you to see it for yourself with your own eyes before we decide anything. But Mr. Whitfield... Her voice caught for just a moment, a small fracture in her composure that she sealed over almost immediately. Please come today, and please hurry. I looked at the river running alongside the path. A great blue heron was standing absolutely still in the shallows, 20 feet away, watching the water with the focused patience of a creature that understood that the right moment always arrives if you are willing to wait for it. Give me 30 minutes, I told her. I was there in 22. Meredith Cole's office occupied a corner suite in the brickyard on Americana Boulevard, a converted early 20th century warehouse with exposed brick walls, high timber ceilings, and the kind of architectural bones that take decades to develop and 5 minutes to appreciate. Under normal circumstances, it was a space I found genuinely pleasant. That morning, walking through the door at 8:34, I felt the room's warmth not at all. Meredith was standing when I entered. No assistant. No coffee on the table. Just a woman in her early 40s with red-rimmed eyes that she had clearly been working very hard to make less obvious, standing next to a long reclaimed wood conference table with a laptop open at its center. Thank you for coming so quickly, she said, and her voice was steadier now, the kind of steadiness that costs something. Please sit down. I sat. She remained standing for a moment, her hands pressed flat on the table on either side of the laptop, as though she needed the surface to hold her up. Patrick delivers his full raw footage files within 2 weeks of each event, she began, along with the edited highlight package. I review the raw footage personally before I close out every event file. I've done it that way for 13 years. I check for anything that needs to be addressed before the final materials go to the client. She drew a slow breath. 3 days ago, I found something in the raw files from Lily's party. Show me, I said. She turned the laptop toward me and pressed play. I will not describe here what was on that footage in detail. I have already told you what it contained, the images and the words, and I will not put myself through the experience of recounting it a second time. What I will tell you is what it felt like to watch it. It felt like standing on a bridge you have just been informed is structurally compromised. Not the moment it collapses, the moment before. When it is still holding your weight, when everything looks exactly as it always has, and you know with the cold certainty of someone who understands load-bearing mathematics that the ground is about to disappear. I watched it once. I asked Meredith to play it again. She did without a word, her jaw tight, her eyes fixed on the wall above the screen. The second time, my hand found a pencil on the table beside the laptop, one of those standard yellow number 2 pencils, the kind I have used to mark up blueprints my entire professional life. I did not make a conscious decision to pick it up. My hand simply found it, and my fingers closed around it, and somewhere around the 14-second mark of the footage, the pencil snapped cleanly in half. I set both pieces down on the table with great care, as though they were still a single object. How long has Patrick worked with you? I asked. My voice came out exactly as I intended it to steady specific gathering information. 8 years. Has he reviewed this segment? No. He delivers the files and moves directly to his next booking. He won't have watched this portion. And you haven't shared this with anyone else. Only you. Meredith's chin was trembling now, a small involuntary movement she was fighting with every muscle in her face. You're her father, Mr. Whitfield. This was your event. You deserved to be the first person to know. I stood up slowly. My legs felt the way structural steel feels when it has been subjected to stress beyond its rated capacity, functional, but changed at a molecular level that no visual inspection would reveal. Meredith. I looked at her directly. What you did this morning, making this call, sitting with this alone until I could get here, that took more integrity than most people are capable of. I want you to know that I recognize that. Her eyes filled, and for a moment I thought she might cry in front of me, but she pressed her lips together and lifted her chin instead, and I recognized the gesture because my daughter does the exact same thing when she is refusing to let her feelings make a scene. There's a copy on this drive I gave you, Meredith said, her voice rough at the edges. Date-stamped, unedited full chain of custody documentation. Whatever you need it for. I thanked her. I walked out into the brickyard courtyard, into the 91-degree July morning, and I sat in my car in the parking lot, with the external drive in my jacket pocket and both hands on the steering wheel. 35 years of engineering had taught me one thing above all others: when you discover a structural failure, the worst thing you can do is act before you understand the full scope of the damage. You assess first. You document everything. You do not touch anything until you know exactly what you are dealing with. I started the engine and pointed the car toward home. There was a great deal I did not yet know, but I was going to find out all of it, every single piece, before I made a single move. I owed Natalie that much. I owed her the whole truth, not just the part that had already broken a pencil in my hand. I have kept a paper notebook for 35 years, not a journal. I want to be clear about that distinction, because the word journal implies a kind of emotional accounting that I have never been particularly suited for. It is a work notebook. Graph paper, black cover, the kind that engineers and field surveyors use when they need to record measurements in conditions that are not kind to technology. I have filled 64 of them over the course of my career. Every significant decision I have ever made about a structural problem began on a page in one of those notebooks. I pulled a fresh one from the drawer in my home office at 9:27 that morning, sat down at the kitchen table, opened it to the first page, and wrote 3 questions. The first, what do I know for certain? The second, what do I not yet know? The third, what does Natalie need from me right now? These were not therapeutic exercises, they were diagnostic steps. The same framework I had used every time I arrived at a job site and found something that should not be there. You begin with what you can confirm. You map the boundaries of your ignorance, and then you ask what the situation actually requires of you as opposed to what your emotions are demanding. What I knew for certain, Brennan Holt had been physically intimate with Celeste Pryor, my daughter's personal assistant, in the second-floor hallway of my home on the night of his stepdaughter's 6th birthday party. The footage was unambiguous. The audio was clear. And the words he had spoken into that directional microphone about Natalie, signing something she did not understand, about Lily being his insurance policy, were not the words of a man who had made a single catastrophic mistake. They were the words of a man who had been running a parallel life for long enough that he had stopped being careful about it. What I did not yet know filled most of the page. What had Natalie signed, and when, who else in Celeste's position had access to Sterling's internal operations? How long had this arrangement been in place? Were there financial implications beyond the personal betrayal? And the question I kept writing, and then crossing out and writing again. How much of the last 3 years had been real? What Natalie needed from me, the truth. All of it. Delivered by someone who loved her not in pieces, not as suspicion, but as documented fact, which meant I could not go to her yet. Not until I knew more. I looked up from the notebook. Through the kitchen window, the backyard was bright and still, the row of lilac bushes Margaret had planted along the back fence casting short shadows in the late morning sun. She had planted them the summer Natalie turned 8, insisting that every house needed something that came back every year without being asked. I had told her with the confident incorrectness of a younger man that lilacs were high maintenance and prone to disease. She had planted them anyway. They had bloomed every April since without a single problem, and she had never once said "I told you so," which was its own form of victory. Margaret would have known exactly what to do in this moment. She had always possessed a clarity of instinct that I admired without being able to fully replicate the ability to cut through the noise of a situation and identify without a checklist what actually mattered. I was sitting here making a checklist because that was the only tool I trusted myself with right now, and I suspected she would have found that both entirely predictable and entirely correct. I picked up my phone and called Theodore Wynne. Theodore had maintained a law office on West Bannock Street for 25 years. He was 58 years old, a corporate attorney who had handled every significant legal question Sterling Construction had encountered since its 3rd year of operation. And he answered his phone on the second ring regardless of the hour, which I had always considered one of his most professionally admirable qualities. "Conrad." His voice was alert, unhurried. "It's been a few weeks. Everything all right?" "No," I said. "I need to talk to you today. Not over the phone, in person at your office this afternoon, if possible." A brief pause. Not the pause of a man who is checking his calendar. The pause of a man who has just recalibrated the nature of the conversation. "I can move my 2 o'clock, Theodore said. "Come in at 1:30. "Thank you." "Conrad." His voice dropped slightly, taking on the careful register he used when a client was about to tell him something he needed to receive accurately. "How serious are we talking?" I looked down at the notebook, at the 2 questions I had answered, and the third one, "What does Natalie need?" that I had written and rewritten 4 times. Serious enough that I drove home from Meredith Cole's office this morning and sat in the garage for 11 minutes before I could make myself come inside. I said. Theodore absorbed that. 1:30, he said. "I'll have coffee ready." I sat with the notebook for another hour after I hung up, going back through my answers to the 3 questions, adding details, checking my reasoning. The way you check load calculations, looking for the assumption that seemed reasonable until it catastrophically wasn't. The exercise did not make me feel better. It was not designed to. It was designed to make me think clearly, and in that it succeeded well enough. At 12:45, I put on a clean shirt, took the external drive from my jacket pocket, placed it in a sealed envelope, and drove downtown to West Bannock Street. Theodore Wynn's office was everything his phone manner suggested, organized, quietly serious, full of the kind of dark wood furniture that communicates reliability without trying to. He was a tall man, silver at the temples, with the particular stillness of someone who had spent 3 decades listening to people tell him things they had never told anyone else, and had learned that the most useful thing he could do in those moments was hold very still and let them finish. He held very still now across the desk from me as I told him everything. The footage, the audio, Celeste Pryor. The specific words Brennan had used about Natalie signing something she did not understand, and about Lily. When I finished, Theodore did not reach immediately for a legal pad or begin outlining options. Instead, he leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a long moment, and when he looked back at me, his expression had the weight of a man who had just started pulling on a thread and could already feel how much was attached to it. "Conrad," he said, "I want to ask you something, and I need you to think carefully before you answer. In the past year, has Brennan ever asked you directly or indirectly about the ownership structure of Sterling Construction, specifically about voting shares, board authority, or what would happen to control of the company if your capacity to make decisions were ever called into question?" My jaw tightened. The question landed in my chest with the blunt force of something I should have seen coming. 6 months ago, I said. He told me he was trying to understand the company Natalie was running. I thought he was being a responsible husband. Theodore nodded slowly, his fingers drumming once on the desk surface, a single quiet tap, the only outward sign of what he was thinking. "I want to make some calls this afternoon," he said. "I need you to give me until tomorrow morning, 6 o'clock. "I'll be awake," I told him. I drove home through downtown Boise in the long afternoon light past the construction sites and the office buildings and the river. And I thought about the question Theodore had just asked me and what it meant that Brennan had been asking it 6 months ago. And I felt the cold thing in my chest, the thing that had settled there in the parking lot of the brickyard, spread a few degrees further in every direction. "Tomorrow at 6 o'clock. Theodore would call. And whatever he had found, I already knew it was going to be worse than a pencil. I was already at the kitchen table when the call came through at 6 o'clock Tuesday morning, July 8th. I had been sitting there since 4:45 with a cup of coffee that had gone cold and a notebook open to a fresh page that I had not yet written anything on because I was waiting to know what I was writing about. The phone rang once and I picked it up. "Tell me," I said. Theodore did not begin with pleasantries. That alone told me something. "I spent yesterday afternoon making calls," he said. "People I trust in the financial and legal community here in Boise. People who hear things through professional channels that don't always make it into public filings." He paused, and the pause had weight to it, the weight of a man who has assembled a picture and is deciding how to describe it to the person it will hurt the most. "Conrad, what I found goes significantly beyond what you showed me yesterday." My hand tightened around the phone. Outside the kitchen window, the lilac bushes were still and dark in the pre-dawn quiet. "All of it," I said. "Start from the beginning." Theodore drew a breath. "Brennan Holt has been in confidential negotiations with a man named Victor Strand, the chief executive of Meridian Pacific Group, an investment firm incorporated in Singapore, but operating in the United States through a Delaware-registered entity. Meridian Pacific has been quietly acquiring stakes in mid-sized construction and infrastructure companies across the Pacific Northwest for the past 4 years. "They want Sterling," I said. It was not a question. "They want Sterling," Theodore confirmed. "The figure Brennan has been negotiating is $340 million for full acquisition, every asset, every contract, every employee, every piece of equipment. The entire company your family built. I set my coffee cup down on the table. My hand was steady. The rest of me was something else entirely. When is this supposed to happen? The transaction is structured to close on the night of Sterling's quarterly board meeting, the one currently scheduled for July 19th. Brennan has been positioning himself over the past several months to have sufficient proxy voting authority to push the sale through without a full board majority. If he succeeds in removing you from any formal decision-making role before that meeting, which is what we believe the documentation Natalie signed is designed to facilitate the transaction, could be executed legally with minimal resistance. The room felt very still. I heard the refrigerator hum. I heard a car pass on Warm Springs Avenue outside. I heard my own breathing slow and deliberate, because the alternative was something I could not afford right now. Theodore, I said carefully, you said we believe. Who else is involved in this conversation? A colleague at a securities law firm in Boise who has encountered Meridian Pacific in a previous transaction. He recognized the pattern, the structure, the timeline, the use of a Delaware entity to obscure the foreign beneficial ownership. Conrad, what Brennan is doing is not merely a breach of his fiduciary duty to Sterling. There is a strong argument that the way he has structured this transaction constitutes securities fraud under federal law. I need to explain what that means because it matters. Securities fraud under United States federal law occurs when someone manipulates financial information or markets in order to deceive investors or gain an unfair financial advantage. In this case, what Theodore was describing was this. Brennan had been using funds routed through Sterling money that belonged to the company and its shareholders to quietly invest in Cascade Development Group, a direct competitor of Sterling in the Idaho construction market. By increasing Cascade's market position, while simultaneously steering business decisions that weakened Sterling's competitive standing, Brennan was artificially deflating Sterling's valuation. A lower valuation meant Meridian Pacific paid less, and the difference between what the company was actually worth and what it was being sold for would, through mechanisms Theodore's colleague was still tracing, ultimately benefit Brennan personally. He had been making Sterling worth less so that he could sell it for less and pocket the gap. How long has he been doing this? I asked. My voice came out harder than I intended, with an edge I had not heard from myself in a long time. The earliest transactions we can identify with reasonable confidence. Theodore said, predate his marriage to Natalie by 14 months. 14 months before the wedding, which meant before the engagement. Which meant Brennan Holt had walked into my daughter's life with this already in motion, had smiled at her and called me sir, and held Lily on his shoulders with a paper birthday crown on his head, and every single moment of it had been a step in a plan he had been running before any of us knew he existed. My jaw ached. I realized I had been clenching it so hard, my back teeth were pressing against each other, and I made a conscious effort to release it, because I needed to think clearly, and physical tension is the enemy of clear thinking. The documentation Natalie signed, I said. What is it? We believe it is a limited power of attorney that under specific triggering conditions would authorize Brennan to act on her behalf in corporate decisions, including potentially voting her shares. The triggering condition appears to be a formal medical finding that you lack decision-making capacity. Theodore's voice was carefully neutral, the way a good attorney's voice is carefully neutral when the information he is conveying is anything but. Which brings me to the next thing I need to tell you. And Conrad, I need you to be sitting down for this one. I almost told him I was already sitting. Instead, I said, go ahead. There is a medical document in existence prepared and signed by a licensed physician that asserts you are in the early stages of cognitive decline and are no longer fully competent to manage your financial and legal affairs. The kitchen went very quiet around me. Margaret's lilac bushes stood motionless outside the window. "Which physician?" I asked. Theodore said a name that hit me like a structural beam swinging out of a crane and catching me squarely across the chest. A name I had known for 30 years. A man who had sat beside me at Margaret's bedside. A man whose handshake I knew as well as my own. "I need to make some calls of my own," I said. My voice was doing something I could not entirely control. It was still steady, but it had gone very flat, the way a seismograph line goes flat before the earthquake registers. "Give me today, Theodore." "Conrad, I'll be in touch by this evening," I said. I ended the call and sat at the kitchen table for a long time, without moving, looking at the open notebook in front of me and the blank page I still had not written anything on. Then I picked up the pen and I wrote one name at the top of the page, and I underlined it twice. Wednesday, July 9th, 6 in the morning. Camel's Back Park sits at the northern edge of Boise, where the city gives way to foothills scrubland. At 6 in the morning in July, it is cool and quiet enough that you can hear your own footsteps on the gravel. I had chosen it for exactly that reason. No offices, no cameras, no connections to Sterling Construction or anyone in it. I arrived at 5:50. The bench at the far end of the Eastern Trail was empty. I sat and waited. Celeste Pryor came down the trail at 6:03. 29 years old, slight dark hair pulled back without care. She wore a gray jacket despite the climbing warmth, arms crossed over her chest, walking the way people walk when every step requires a separate decision. She stopped 4 feet from the bench and looked at me. "Mr. Whitfield." Her voice was thin and tight. "I didn't know if you would come yourself." "Sit down, Celeste," I said. She sat at the far end of the bench and pulled her jacket tighter. Her hands were trembling. Small, quick tremors she pressed flat against her thighs, except they were not hidden. She broke before I said another word. "I'm sorry." The words came fast and ragged, her eyes filling immediately, not a slow welling, but a sudden flood she could not stop. I didn't understand what he was building, not at the beginning. I swear I didn't know the full plan until 4 months ago, and by then I was so far in, I couldn't see a way out. She pressed her fingers hard against her mouth, took a breath that shook. "I keep saying sorry, and I know it doesn't fix anything." "Tell me how it started," I said. "All of it." 18 months before Brennan married Natalie, Celeste had been a graduate student at Boise State MBA program, $47,000 in student loan debt, 2 part-time jobs to stay afloat. Brennan had found her at a networking event at the Boise Center. He was warm, attentive, genuinely interested in her work. By the 3rd meeting, he had made his offer someone with intelligence and discretion, positioned inside Sterling Construction, reporting on board decisions, financial movements, anything Natalie said that touched on ownership or control. In exchange, he would clear her $47,000 within 60 days. "He called it due diligence," Celeste said. A broken sound escaped her, almost a laugh carrying nothing of one. "He said he was going to run the company alongside Natalie and needed to understand it from the inside. He made it sound reasonable." She wiped her face roughly. "I told myself it wasn't wrong. I told myself that for a long time." "But you knew," I said. "Not an accusation, a fact." Her chin crumpled. "Yes," she whispered. "I knew." She had applied for the assistant position at Sterling 4 months later, Brennan clearing her resume through channels she did not ask about. She was genuinely good at the job. Natalie would have removed incompetence within a week. But she had been feeding Brennan internal information for 3 years, and when his requests escalated 4 months ago, specific financial records, board attendance, upcoming vote details, she understood for the first time how large the thing she had agreed to actually was. "He told me Lily was his insurance policy," I said. Celeste flinched as though I had struck her. Her hand went to her mouth, and the tears came in earnest shoulders, pulling inward a sound from her chest she was fighting to contain and losing. "I heard him say it in the hallway," she said when she could speak. "That was the night I decided. "What do you have?" I asked. She reached into her jacket and removed a small black USB drive. Her hand was shaking so badly, I reached across and took it gently rather than waiting. 7 recordings, she said. 4 months of meetings. Brennan and a man named Sheldon Krause Sterling's CFO. He's been in this from the start. And a third man. She paused. I only heard his name twice. Harlan. Every muscle in my body went rigid. Harlan Voss, I said. She nodded and watched my face change and said nothing while it did. I told her Theodore Wynne would contact her that afternoon. A formal cooperation agreement, full legal protection, in exchange for her testimony and the recordings. She nodded, tears still running freely, no longer trying to stop them. I stood and walked back up the eastern trail toward the parking lot, the USB drive closed inside my fist. There was a name on that drive I had not expected, and it changed everything I thought I understood about how deep this went. Ray Callum had worked in corporate security for 22 years, the last 15 of which he had spent as head of security operations at Sterling Construction. He was 50 years old, broad-shouldered, with the quiet watchfulness of a man who had spent 2 decades noticing things other people missed. I had hired him in 2009 after a series of internal data breaches that our previous security framework had failed to catch. And in the years since, he had never once given me a reason to question that decision. I called him at 9 that morning and asked him to meet me at the Sterling offices on South 5th Street after business hours. I told him to come alone and to tell no one he was coming. He asked no questions. That was one of the things I valued most about Ray Callum. He understood instinctively the difference between information he needed and information he did not. We met in the server room on the 11th floor at 7:15 that evening. The room was cold, the way server rooms always are, the air carrying that particular electric smell of machinery running at full capacity, the overhead lighting flat and without shadow. Ray had already pulled up the financial monitoring interface on the main terminal by the time I arrived. I handed him the USB drive Celeste had given me that morning. He plugged it in, opened the first file, and listened to 40 seconds of audio before he looked up at me with an expression that told me he had already understood what we were dealing with. How do you want to do this? He asked. Methodically, I said. The way we do everything. Ray nodded and turned back to the screen. What followed was 3 hours of the most painstaking financial reconstruction I had witnessed outside of a formal audit. Ray moved through Sterling's internal transaction records with the precision of a man who had been trained to find exactly what someone did not want found. Using the account access credentials that Celeste had provided, credentials that Brennan had given her as part of her operational role, making her access legally authorized, and therefore our use of it legally defensible, Ray began tracing a pattern of transactions that had been designed with considerable sophistication to be invisible. The vehicle was a limited liability company called Meridian Bridge Holdings, registered in the state of Delaware. I want to explain why Delaware matters here because it is not accidental. Delaware has some of the most permissive corporate formation laws in the United States. A company can be registered there in a single day with minimal disclosure requirements, and the identity of its true owners can be legally shielded behind layers of registered agents and nominee directors. It is entirely legal. It is also, for that precise reason, the preferred structure of people who want to move money without being easily traced. Meridian Bridge Holdings had been created 14 months ago. Its registered agent was a law firm in Wilmington that Ray recognized immediately as one that specialized in high-volume anonymous entity formation. The company had no physical office, no employees, and no publicly stated business purpose. What it had was a bank account in Boise, Idaho, that had received a total of $2.3 million from Sterling Construction over the course of 8 months, distributed across 26 separate transactions, each one small enough to fall below the internal threshold that would have triggered an automatic compliance review. 26 transactions, 8 months. $2.3 million. Ray pulled up the corresponding outflow records from the Meridian Bridge account. Most of the money had moved within 72 hours of arrival, transferred onward to a brokerage account that Ray's access credentials could identify but not fully open. What he could see was the account holder's name on the receiving end. Brennan Holt. Ray leaned back in his chair and let out a long, slow breath through his nose. His jaw was set hard the way a man's jaw sets when he is angry and has decided that anger is not useful right now. "There's more," he said. He pulled up a second set of records, these from Sterling's investment activity log, a quarterly report that Sheldon Krause, as CFO, was responsible for compiling and that the board reviewed without detailed scrutiny because Sheldon had been producing it without incident for 9 years. "You see these positions here?" Ray pointed to a series of equity purchases spread across 6 quarters. "These are shares in Cascade Development Group." Cascade Development Group was Sterling Construction's most direct competitor in the Idaho market. They had been gaining ground on us for 2 years in state infrastructure contracts, a trend the board had discussed with frustration at multiple meetings, attributing it to market conditions and aggressive pricing on Cascade's part. Sheldon was buying Cascade stock with Sterling funds. My voice was flat. "Not Sheldon directly," Ray said. "Routed through a subsidiary account that Sheldon controlled, but that wasn't flagged in the standard reporting structure. Whoever set this up knew exactly where the blind spots were." He looked at me. "Mr. Whitfield, someone helped design this from inside the company. This didn't come from outside knowledge of our systems." I stood very still, my hands at my sides, and looked at the numbers on the screen. $2.3 million moving out. Cascade shares moving up. Sterling's competitive position moving down. And on July 19th, 10 days from now, a board meeting at which Brennan Holt intended to sell the entire company at a valuation that these manipulations had artificially suppressed. It was elegant in the way that deliberately constructed failures are sometimes elegant, every element serving every other element. The whole thing designed to collapse in exactly the direction he needed it to fall. "Ray," I said, "I need everything you have found tonight documented, formatted, and stored on an encrypted drive that lives nowhere near this building. Can you have that ready by tomorrow morning?" "By 6 a.m., he said without hesitation. "Good." I picked up my jacket from the back of the chair. My hands were steady. The cold of the server room had settled into my bones during the past 3 hours, and I welcomed it. It matched something in my chest that had been cold since Tuesday morning and showed no sign of warming. "One more thing. When you review those audio files tonight, you will hear 3 names mentioned repeatedly. I need you to note every instance, timestamp, context, exact wording. Every single one." Ray looked at me steadily. "Understood." I took the elevator down to the ground floor and walked out onto South 5th Street into the warm July night. Above the downtown buildings, the sky had gone the deep blue of late evening, the first stars appearing above the foothills. Somewhere in this city, Brennan Holt was having dinner or watching television or tucking Lily into bed with that easy smile of his. I flagged the date on my phone, July 9th. 10 days until the board meeting. 10 days was enough. It had to be. Ray called me at 11:47 that night. I was still awake, sitting at the kitchen table with the notebook open in front of me, adding to the timeline I had been building since Monday morning. When the phone rang and I saw Ray's name on the screen, I felt something shift in my chest, not surprise exactly, but the particular bracing sensation of a man who knows the next piece of information is going to require him to absorb something hard. "I found something in the audio files," Ray said. His voice was careful in a way it had not been earlier in the evening. "File number 4, recorded approximately 11 weeks ago. You need to hear a specific section. Play it." The recording was clear, the directional quality of a phone left face down on a table, picking up everything in the room above it. 3 voices. I recognized Brennan's immediately. The second voice Ray had already identified as Sheldon Krause, based on the personnel records he had cross-referenced. The third voice was one I did not immediately place lower, older, unhurried. Brennan's voice came through first. The medical documentation needs to be finalized before the 15th. If we walk into that board meeting without it, we have no mechanism to challenge his standing. The older voice responded, I understand the timeline. I've reviewed the file. I can have it signed and notarized by end of week. Something about the cadence, the particular way the words were spaced. A rhythm I had heard across 30 years of Friday morning breakfasts and phone calls in hospital waiting rooms. Ray, I said. My voice had gone very quiet. Who is the third voice? I ran it against personnel records and external contacts registered in Sterling's system, Ray said. The name that came up is Dr. Walter Price. He's listed as your personal physician in your employee file from when you were active CEO. I set the phone down on the table, pressed the speaker function, and stood up. Dr. Walter Price had been my doctor for 31 years. He had treated Margaret through 2 rounds of pneumonia and the early symptoms that preceded her stroke. He had been in the waiting room of St. Alphonsus Regional Medical Center the night she died, and he had put his hand on my shoulder afterward and said nothing, because he understood that there was nothing to say, and that understanding had meant more to me than any words could have. He had known Natalie since she was 3 years old. He had been in the waiting room of St. Alphonsus the night Lily was born, and had shaken Brennan's hand in the corridor afterward and said she was perfect. Tell me what the document says, I said. Ray read from the file he had located, a formal medical assessment typed on official letterhead bearing Dr. Walter Price's license number and signature. It stated that Conrad James Whitfield, age 60, had presented with measurable cognitive decline, consistent with early-stage dementia, and that in the physician's professional opinion, Mr. Whitfield's capacity to make sound financial and legal decisions had been materially compromised. The document was dated 5 weeks ago, 3 weeks before Lily's birthday party, which meant that on the evening I had stood in my living room feeling for the first time in years that everything was exactly right. Walter Price had already signed a piece of paper designed to strip me of my legal standing. Is it in the board meeting materials? I asked. It's attached to a supplementary agenda item filed under Brennan Holt's name for the July 19th meeting, Ray said. Agenda item 6, titled Review of Executive Governance and Succession Planning. I walked to the kitchen window. The backyard was dark, the lilac bushes invisible in the night, but I knew exactly where they were. Margaret had planted them in the 3rd row from the fence, alternating purple and white, and every spring they came back without being asked, exactly as she had promised they would. Walter had been at the funeral. He had helped me carry one of the arrangements to the car. Ray, I said, and I was surprised by how steady my voice remained. I need the complete document, original file metadata, date stamps, everything, on the encrypted drive with the rest. Already done, Ray said. Go home, get some sleep, you've done enough for one night. After I ended the call, I stood at the kitchen window for a long time, not moving, one hand pressed flat against the cold glass. Outside, somewhere beyond the dark yard and the sleeping neighborhood, Walter Price was in his house on Overland Road, presumably asleep with 31 years of shared history between us and a forged medical document bearing his signature sitting in a board meeting agenda file. I thought about the last time we had spoken 3 weeks ago, a brief call to confirm my annual physical scheduled for August. His voice had been warm, normal. He had asked about Lily's birthday and told me to say hello to Natalie. The rage that moved through me then was different from the cold, methodical anger I had been carrying since Monday. This was something older and raw, the specific devastation of discovering that someone you trusted with your family's most vulnerable moments had sold that trust for reasons I did not yet fully understand. But I needed to understand them, because Walter Price's signature on that document was not just a betrayal. It was a legal instrument that Brennan intended to use in 10 days to dismantle everything I had built. And before I could stop it, I needed to know exactly why Walter had put it there. I opened the notebook, found the page where I had written the name and underlined it twice, and beneath it I wrote 4 words. Tomorrow morning, Lucky 13. Thursday morning, July 10th. Lucky 13, cafe on North 13th Street, had not changed in 20 years. Red vinyl booths, strong coffee. A breakfast menu that the Clinton administration would have recognized. Walter Price and I had eaten there most Friday mornings for the better part of 2 decades. I had always found comfort in that consistency. This morning I found none. I arrived at 7:50 and took our usual corner booth facing the door. I ordered coffee and did not open the menu. My stomach would not have accepted anything. Walter came through the door at 8:03, and I knew before he reached the table that he had not slept. He was 63 years old, a tall man who had spent his career moving through rooms with the quiet authority of someone whose judgment had never seriously failed him. That authority was gone this morning. His shoulders carried a weight his posture could not conceal, and his eyes found me too quickly across the room, the way guilty eyes always do. He sat down. The waitress filled his cup and left. He wrapped both hands around the mug and looked at me, and I watched the moment he understood from whatever he saw in my face that I already knew more than he had prepared for. I reached into my jacket and placed the printed copy of the medical assessment on the table between us. Face up. I pushed it gently toward him and said nothing. Every muscle in Walter's face went still. Then his eyes filled suddenly completely, and his chin dropped toward his chest, and his shoulders curved inward the way a structure curves when the load finally exceeds what it was built to carry. Conrad. His voice came out barely above a whisper, stripped of everything professional. I don't know how to... Tell me why, I said, from the beginning. He pressed his fingers hard against his eyes. When he lowered his hand, his face was wet, and he did not try to hide it. 14 months ago. He began, his voice breaking and recovering. Brennan came to my office. He said he was concerned about you changes in your behavior, your decision-making. He was convincing. Walter's jaw tightened hard. He was always very convincing. What did he have on you? I asked. Walter's knuckles went pale around the mug. 11 years ago, I made an error. A surgical referral, a recommendation I should have reviewed more carefully. The outcome was very bad. The family filed a malpractice suit, settled out of court, confidential. He stopped, drew a breath that shook on the way in. Brennan had the settlement documentation. He told me that if I did not prepare the assessment, he would send it to the Idaho Medical Board and 3 local news organizations. Your license, I said. My license, my practice. 30 years. His voice collapsed entirely. He pressed his fist against his mouth, his whole body shaking with the effort of holding himself together. I let him sit with it. The anger in my chest was still there, cold, real, patient. But underneath it was something I had not expected, the recognition of how a man who is not fundamentally bad can be brought to do something fundamentally wrong, and how the shame of it becomes its own life sentence. And is there any clinical basis in that document? I asked. Any real finding, any actual examination? He shook his head immediately. None. You are in excellent health, Conrad. I fabricated the entire document from a template. There is not a single observation in it that came from a real examination. Good, I said, because I need that on record. I told him Theodore Wynne would call him that afternoon, a formal sworn recantation fully documented, submitted to the federal prosecutor before any charges were filed. Voluntary cooperation at that stage, I explained, is treated very differently under federal sentencing guidelines than cooperation that comes after an indictment. Walter nodded. Something shifted in his posture. The particular change that comes when a person has been carrying something alone for too long, and someone finally tells them they can put it down. Conrad, he said, his voice rough and small. I am sorry. I know that is not. Theodore will call you this afternoon, I said. Be available. I stood left 2 20s on the table for a $4 cup of coffee and walked out into the July morning. The sunlight hit me hard and bright on 13th Street. 9 days until the board meeting. Walter Price would cooperate, and the document he had signed was about to become the most damaging piece of evidence against the man who had asked him to sign it. Before I tell you what Natalie discovered on her own comment, the word trust below, so I know you are still with me. Because what comes next changed everything between a father and his daughter. A note for new listeners. This story contains fictional elements crafted for storytelling and reflection. Some details may not reflect any specific situation if that is not your kind of content. This is a good moment to step away. But if you are staying, I think you will want to hear this. What I am about to tell you, Natalie told me the following morning. She sat across from me at the kitchen table on Friday, July 11th, with both hands wrapped around a mug of tea she had not touched, and she told me everything that had happened the previous evening in the same careful, sequential order that I had taught her to use when presenting a structural analysis, beginning to end, no editorializing facts before conclusions. I am going to tell it to you the same way she told it to me, because it deserves to be told that way. Thursday evening, July 10th, 7:45 p.m. Natalie had stayed late at the Sterling offices on South 5th Street, which was not unusual. What was unusual was what she was doing. She was not reviewing contracts or preparing for the upcoming board meeting. She was sitting at her desk with Brennan's personal laptop open in front of her, the one he occasionally left at the office when he worked late, the one whose password she had memorized 8 months ago, without intending to, simply by watching him type it from across the room, on an evening when his attention was elsewhere. She had been carrying a suspicion for 4 months. Not a certainty, a suspicion. The kind that lives in the peripheral vision of your awareness and refuses to come into focus no matter how directly you look at it. It had begun with a discrepancy in the first quarter financial summary, a rounding that was not quite right in a line item that should have been straightforward, the kind of thing that most people would attribute to a clerical error and move past without a second thought. Natalie did not move past it. She had been trained from the time she was old enough to sit beside me at a drafting table to treat small anomalies with the same seriousness as large ones, because in structural engineering and in business, the catastrophic failures almost always begin as something small enough to dismiss. She had said nothing to me. She had said nothing to anyone. Because a suspicion without evidence is not a finding, it is a feeling, and feelings do not hold up in a boardroom or a courtroom. And Natalie Whitfield had not built a career on feelings, so she had done something deliberate and methodical that I would not learn about until she told me, and that made my chest ache with a pride so sharp it was almost painful when I finally understood it. Over the previous 3 months, Brennan had asked her to sign 4 separate documents, 2 relating to financial planning, 1 a corporate governance amendment, 1 described to her as a routine legal housekeeping measure. She had signed all 4. But before signing each one, she had photographed every page with her personal phone, stored the images in an encrypted folder, and sent copies to her own personal attorney, a woman named Claire Osberg, who practiced corporate law on West State Street, and who had been Natalie's private counsel, separate from Sterling's legal team, for 2 years. She had signed the documents because refusing would have alerted Brennan that she was watching. She had documented everything because she intended at the right moment to know exactly what she had signed and what it meant. On the evening of July 10th, sitting alone in her office with his laptop open in front of her, Natalie found the folder. It was labeled Project Meridian. It contained 43 emails, 11 financial spreadsheets, 3 draft agreements, and a contact file for someone named Victor Strand. She read for 2 hours without stopping. By the time she closed the laptop, her hands were trembling. Not from fear, she told me, but from the specific physical response of a body that has been holding itself very tightly for a very long time and has just been given permission to feel the weight of what it has been carrying. She drove to Donna Whitfield's house. Donna is my younger sister by 6 years. She is 54, a high school art teacher who lives in a craftsman bungalow on Resegee Street in the North End neighborhood, and she has the particular quality of stillness that some people develop when they have spent decades being the calm point around which louder personalities orbit. She had loved Natalie fiercely since Natalie was born, and Natalie had known with the instinct of someone who has always understood where the solid ground is that Donna's kitchen table was the right place to go on a night like this one. Natalie arrived at Donna's door at 10:15, and Donna opened it before she could knock twice because Donna had seen the headlights from the front window and recognized the car and was already moving. She told me that when Natalie came through the door, she did not cry. Not immediately. She sat down at Donna's kitchen table, and she laid out everything she had found, in order the way I had taught her, and her voice stayed level through most of it. It was only when she got to the section of the emails where Brennan had referred to Natalie's position at Sterling as a transitional asset, meaning she was a means to an end, a vehicle for accessing the company, a role to be discarded once the acquisition was complete, that her composure finally broke. Donna told me later that Natalie cried for 11 minutes. Not quietly. The kind of crying that comes from somewhere deeper than the throat. The kind that surprises you with how much force it carries, how much it has been waiting. Donna sat beside her the entire time with one hand on her back and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that was more useful than presence. Then Natalie stopped. She straightened up. She wiped her face with both hands, the rough, decisive gesture of a woman putting something away so she can get to work. "I need to call Dad in the morning," she told Donna. Donna told me that what she felt in that moment was something she could only describe as witnessing. "That girl," Donna said, her voice tight with feeling, "is every good thing the two of you ever put into her." Natalie sent me a text at 11:47 that night. 4 words. "Dad, I know everything. I was at the kitchen table when it arrived." I read it twice. Then I set the phone face down on the table and pressed both palms flat against the wood and took the first full breath I had taken since Monday morning. My daughter had been fighting this battle alongside me the entire time, and I had not known. We had been moving toward the same truth from opposite directions, each of us alone, each of us protecting the other by not saying anything yet. 8 days until the board meeting. Tomorrow, we would face it together. Natalie arrived at 7:15 Friday morning with a manila folder under one arm, and a look on her face that I recognized immediately. It was the expression she wore when she had already done the analysis, and was ready to present her findings, the one that meant her emotions had been processed privately, and what remained was the work. She had her mother's discipline. Margaret had always been able to separate the feeling from the function in a way I admired without being able to fully replicate, and watching Natalie walk through my front door that morning. Eyes clear, jaw set, folder held against her chest, with the calm precision of a woman who had cried everything she needed to cry the night before, and was finished with that part. I felt something move through me that was equal parts pride and grief because the person who should have been sitting at this table with us was not here, and she would have known exactly what to say. I put coffee on. Natalie sat at the kitchen table and opened her folder without being asked. "I want to go through what I have," she said, "and then I want to hear what you have, and then we figure out what comes next." "All right," I said. She went first. She walked me through the Project Meridian folder, 43 emails, the financial spreadsheets, the draft acquisition agreements, the contact records for Victor Strand. She presented it the way she runs board meetings, structured, sequential, no redundancy. Her voice was steady throughout. When she reached the email in which Brennan had referred to her position at Sterling as a transitional asset, her jaw tightened and her hand pressed flat against the table. For a moment, one breath, two, and then she continued. When she finished, she closed the folder and looked at me across the table. "Your turn," she said. I told her everything. The footage from Patrick Odom's camera, Meredith Cole's call on Monday morning, the broken pencil, Theodore's findings about Victor Strand, and the $340 million acquisition. Celeste Pryor in Camel's Back Park, the USB drive, the 7 recordings. Ray Callum in the server room with the Meridian Bridge Holdings transactions and the Cascade development shares. Dr. Walter Price at Lucky 13, the forged medical assessment, the malpractice settlement Brennan had used as leverage, and Price's agreement to cooperate. Natalie listened to all of it without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Not the silence of someone who has nothing to say, but the silence of someone organizing a great deal of information very quickly. "How long have you known?" she asked. "Since Monday," I said. "You, 4 months." She exhaled slowly. "I kept thinking I needed one more piece before I came to you. I didn't want to bring you something I couldn't prove." "Neither did I said. She looked at me for a long moment, and then something happened that I had not anticipated. She laughed. A short, almost disbelieving sound, not from humor, but from the particular absurdity of discovering that two people who love each other have been carrying the same weight in opposite directions, each one protecting the other from a burden the other was already bearing. "We're both idiots," she said. "We're both engineers," I said. "It's the same thing." She pressed her fingers briefly against her eyes, composing herself, and when she lowered her hand, her expression had shifted into the focused clarity of a woman who was done looking backward. "5 layers of evidence," she said, counting on her fingers. "The footage with audio, the financial transactions through Meridian Bridge, the Project Meridian emails, the forged medical assessment with Price willing to recant on record, and the 7 audio recordings with Brennan Sheldon Krause and Harlan Voss." At the mention of Harlan Voss, her eyes met mine. Of all the things I had told her, that name had produced the only visible flinch, a brief tightening around her eyes, gone almost before it registered. She had known Harlan Voss since childhood. He had attended her college graduation. He had danced with her at her wedding. "We'll deal with that," I said. "Yes," she said. "We will." She straightened in her chair. "I'm calling Claire Osberg this morning. I want her reviewing the documents Brennan had me sign before Theodore files anything. We need to know exactly what legal authority those signatures actually conveyed and how to neutralize it before the 19th. "Agreed," I said. "Theodore is expecting your call as well. He wants all counsel coordinated before we make any moves." We spent the next 2 hours at the kitchen table mapping every element of what we had against every element of what Brennan had built, looking for gaps, the way you look for gaps in a load-bearing structure, methodically, without assumption, testing every connection point. We found 3 places where the evidence chain needed strengthening, and we identified exactly what documentation would close each gap. By 10 o'clock, the plan for July 19th was complete in its essential structure. Theodore would file the necessary legal instruments. Ray Callum would have the encrypted documentation package ready. Claire Osberg would prepare a formal legal analysis of the documents Natalie had signed, establishing that the power of attorney Brennan believed he held was either invalid on its face or revocable under Idaho law, given the circumstances of its procurement. And on the morning of July 19th, Conrad and Natalie Whitfield would walk into the boardroom of Sterling Construction with everything they needed. Before Natalie left, she stood at the front door with her folder tucked under her arm and looked at me the way she has looked at me since she was small, when she wanted to say something important and was deciding how to say it correctly. "Dad," she said, "I need you to know something. Whatever happens on the 19th, I built this company into what it is because of what you taught me. Not the engineering. The other thing. The part about how you treat a structure that someone has tried to compromise." She paused. "You find the fault. You document it. and then you fix it properly so it never fails the same way again. My throat did something that I was not going to discuss. Go call Claire, I said. She smiled her mother's smile wide and unguarded and walked to her car. I stood in the doorway and watched her go, and then I went back inside and stood at the kitchen window and looked at Margaret's lilac bushes in the morning light, and I said very quietly, to no one in particular, and to one person specifically, "She's ready, Margaret. She has been for a long time." Theodore Wynne had been practicing corporate law in Boise for 31 years, and in that time he had dealt with regulatory agencies, state oversight boards, and federal compliance offices on behalf of dozens of clients. He had never in 3 decades of practice placed a call to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He placed one on Saturday morning, July 12th. He told me about it that afternoon when I came into his office on West Bannock Street, a meeting he had requested with the particular terseness of a man who has information that cannot wait until Monday. I sat across his desk and he folded his hands on the surface in front of him and told me what he had done and why, in the organized, unhurried manner of someone who has thought carefully about how to present something that is going to land hard. When Victor Strand's name came up in connection with this transaction, Theodore began. I recognized the structure immediately. A foreign-controlled entity acquiring a domestic company that holds active government contracts. That is not simply a corporate governance matter, Conrad. Under federal law, it triggers mandatory review by the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, CFI-US. I need to explain what CFI-US is because it matters to everything that follows. The Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States is a federal interagency body that reviews transactions in which foreign entities seek to acquire or exercise control over American businesses, specifically when those businesses have connections to national security, critical infrastructure, or government contracts. Sterling Construction held 3 active contracts with the Idaho Department of Transportation road and bridge projects, totaling $61 million. That was sufficient. Brennan never filed for CFY-US review, Theodore continued, because filing would have required disclosing the foreign beneficial ownership of the acquiring entity, which would have exposed the entire transaction to federal scrutiny before it could be completed. He was planning to execute the sale and notify regulators afterward, presenting it as a done deal, notifying regulators only after the transaction had already closed. That is a federal crime, I said. Multiple federal crimes, Theodore confirmed. Which is why I contacted the FBI's Idaho field office on West Fort Street yesterday evening. I spoke with a supervisory agent named Marcus Webb. Theodore paused. He was already aware of Victor Strand. That stopped me. Already aware. Meridian Pacific Group has been under peripheral surveillance for 14 months in connection with a separate transaction in Oregon that raised similar concerns. Agent Webb's team had not yet identified Sterling as a target, but when I provided the documentation we had assembled, he recognized the pattern immediately. Theodore reached into his desk drawer and slid a business card across to me. He wants to meet with you. Today, if possible. The FBI's Idaho field office occupies a building on West Fort Street that is deliberately unremarkable, the kind of structure that announces nothing about itself, which is, I suppose, the point. I arrived at 3 o'clock that afternoon. A receptionist led me to a conference room on the 2nd floor, where Agent Marcus Webb was already waiting. Marcus Webb was 44 years old, lean and precise in the way of someone who had spent 2 decades making careful decisions in high-stakes environments. He wore a gray suit that was not quite as expensive as the suits Brennan Holt favored, and he had the particular quality of attention fully present, slightly ahead of the conversation that I associated with people who were very good at their work. He stood when I entered and extended his hand. His grip was firm and brief. "Mr. Whitfield," he said, "thank you for coming in on a Saturday. Thank you for seeing me," I said. We sat down on opposite sides of the conference table, and Agent Webb opened a thin folder in front of him, and looked at me with the focused calm of a man who had already read everything in it. "Your attorney has provided us with a substantial preliminary package," he said. "I want to ask you some questions about the timeline, and then I want to tell you what we are able to do and when." He clicked his pen once. "First, when did Brennan Holt first make contact with Victor Strand, to the best of your knowledge?" "Theodore's research indicates 14 months before his marriage to my daughter," I said. "Approximately 30 months ago." Agent Webb nodded, making a note. "That is consistent with what we have on our end. We have communication records between Strand and an intermediary connected to Holt going back 28 months. He looked up. "Mr. Whitfield, I want to be direct with you. What you have brought us, the audio recordings, the financial documentation, the forged medical assessment, is significantly more than we had. Combined with our existing surveillance on Meridian Pacific, we have sufficient basis to proceed." My hands pressed flat against the table. "What does proceeding look like?" "We will have arrest warrants prepared for Brennan Holt and at least one additional subject by the morning of July 19th, Agent Webb said. "I am not in a position to confirm other names until the warrants are issued, but I want you to understand that our scope extends beyond the primary subject." He leaned forward slightly. "I need to ask you to do something that I understand will be extremely difficult." "Name it," I said. "Do not alter your behavior in any way between now and the 19th. Do not confront Holt. Do not give him any indication that you are aware of the full scope of what he has been doing. We need him to walk into that board meeting believing he is in complete control of the situation." The thing that moved through my chest at that instruction was something I did not have a clean name for, a compound of fury and discipline that required me to hold two completely opposing impulses in the same body without letting either one win. I had 7 days to sit across dinner tables from Brennan Holt, to accept his handshakes and his calls of "sir," to watch him with Lily knowing what I knew. "I understand," I said. Agent Webb looked at me steadily. "I believe you do," he said. I drove home from West Fort Street through the Saturday afternoon traffic through the downtown blocks and across the river and up toward Warm Springs Avenue, and I thought about 7 days of performance. 7 days of being the man Brennan Holt believed I was, so that on the 8th day he would walk into a room and discover who I actually was. 7 days. I had built bridges that took longer than that. I could manage 7 days. The Sunday morning felt deceptively ordinary. I made coffee the way Margaret always insisted, 2 minutes of bloom time before pressing the French press, no shortcuts. Outside, the Boise foothills were golden under early July light, and the sprinklers on Warm Springs Avenue were already running their quiet mechanical rounds. 6 days until the board meeting. 6 days of pretending nothing had shifted beneath my feet. My phone buzzed at 7:42 a.m. Not Theodore, not Ray, a number I did not recognize, area code 208 local. I answered. "Mr. Whitfield." The voice was direct, neither aggressive nor apologetic. "My name is Sophie Caldwell. I'm an investigative reporter at the Boise Tribune. I've been covering corporate governance and securities regulation in the Mountain West for 11 years. I'm sorry to call on a Sunday, but I believe you may want to hear what I've found before it goes to print." I set my coffee down slowly. "How did you get this number, Ms. Caldwell?" "Sterling's current filing with the Idaho Secretary of State lists a founder contact line. It routed to you." A pause. "I'm not calling to ambush you, Mr. Whitfield. I've spent the last 3 weeks reviewing SEC filings, Delaware corporate registrations, and shareholder correspondence. Certain patterns involving Sterling Construction and an entity called Meridian Bridge Holdings have raised serious questions. I'd like to give you an opportunity to comment before we publish." My jaw tightened. She already had the shell company name. That meant she had gotten there independently, not through Ray's report, not through Theodore's files. A journalist had found the thread on her own. "Where would you like to meet?" I asked. We agreed on a coffee shop on West Idaho Street 40 minutes later. I arrived first. Sophie Caldwell was younger than her voice suggested, 38, with dark auburn hair pulled back a weathered leather notebook, and the kind of steady eye contact that told me she had spent years sitting across from people who did not want to be interviewed. She ordered black coffee and opened her notebook without ceremony. Meridian Bridge Holdings, LLC. She began sliding a printed sheet across the table. Registered in Delaware 14 months ago. Single managing member listed as a trust entity based in Nevada. The Nevada Trust has a registered agent with ties to Meridian Pacific Capital, a Singapore-headquartered private equity fund. I cross-referenced the fund's prior acquisitions with Sterling's contractor profile. She tapped the page. Sterling holds $61 million in Idaho Department of Transportation contracts. That makes any foreign acquisition subject to CFIUS review. There's no record of a filing. She watched my face. I kept it neutral, the same expression I used in 30 years of contractor negotiations, when the numbers were bad and the client was watching. "What is it you want from me, Ms. Caldwell?" I asked. "I want to know if Sterling's founding leadership is aware of what's being prepared." She leaned forward slightly. "I've covered securities fraud in this region for over a decade, Mr. Whitfield. I've seen companies hollowed out from the inside. The pattern I'm looking at, shell entity suppressed valuation, a shareholder meeting date that happens to align with a foreign acquisition timeline, it has a signature." I told her what I could say without compromising the federal cooperation that I was aware of, irregularities, that legal counsel was engaged, and that any statement beyond that would need to come through my attorney. She accepted that with the professionalism of someone who had heard it before and knew how to read between the lines. We were wrapping up when the door opened. Harlan Voss walked in. He was not looking for coffee. His eyes moved across the room with the practiced sweep of a man checking a space before entering it fully. And when they landed on me, something shifted behind them, not surprise, not friendliness. A calculation. He recovered immediately, adjusting his expression into the warm, grandfatherly ease that had made him one of the most trusted voices in Sterling's boardroom for 22 years. "Conrad." He crossed the room with his hand extended. "Didn't expect to see you here on a Sunday morning." "Harlan." I shook his hand. "Just catching up with an old contact, you know how it is." His eyes moved briefly to Sophie, then back to me. "Of course." He smiled. "Big week coming. Board meeting Thursday. Should be straightforward." He said it the way you'd say the weather looked fine, easy offhand final. Then he ordered an espresso to go and left without looking back. Sophie watched the door close behind him. "Who was that?" "A board member," I said. 22 years. She wrote something in her notebook. I did not ask what. Walking back to my car, I turned the encounter over in my mind. Harlan had not been surprised to see me. He had been measuring me, calculating what I knew, what I had said, and how much time remained before Thursday. He had come into that coffee shop for a reason, and it was not espresso. 6 days had felt manageable in Theodore's office. Now standing in the July heat with Sophie Caldwell's business card in my shirt pocket, and Harlan Voss's steady eyes still present in my memory, I began to understand something I had been avoiding. The man I had trusted longest in that boardroom might be the most dangerous one in the room. Theodore called at 6 in the morning, which by now I had come to understand was simply how he operated. The man had never once telephoned me at a reasonable hour. Every call landed in the gray zone between night and day, as if the law itself refused to keep office hours. "He's going to move the asset," Theodore said without greeting. "Brennan filed paperwork last Friday with a private trust company in Meridian. He's transferring personal holdings, real estate brokerage accounts, a partnership interest in a Scottsdale development into a self-settled trust. He's trying to insulate them from civil liability before the board meeting." I poured my coffee standing up. "Can he do that?" "He can try. Idaho has a 10-year fraudulent transfer look-back period, so it won't protect him from anything tied to Sterling. But he doesn't know we know that." Theodore's voice carried the measured calm of a man who had already thought 3 steps further. Here's what's interesting. The trust document he filed names Lily as a secondary beneficiary. I set the mug down. He used Lily. He used Lily, Theodore confirmed. In his mind, it creates sympathy. If he's ever prosecuted, his attorney argues he was protecting his daughter's inheritance. It's a fairly standard asset protection maneuver. What Brennan doesn't know is that we filed first. 3 weeks earlier, before the board meeting was even confirmed, Theodore had prepared an irrevocable trust document under Idaho Code naming Lily Whitfield as sole primary beneficiary and Conrad Whitfield as trustee. The document included a subordination clause publicly recorded, visible to anyone who looked, stating that any subsequent gift deed or trust transfer naming Lily as beneficiary would be subordinate to the prior established trust, consolidating all assets under Conrad's stewardship. Judge Patricia Owens had reviewed and signed the order in chambers on July 10th, the morning after the Lucky 13 meeting. Theodore had not told me to feel good about this. He had told me it was necessary. Brennan signs his document today, Theodore said. He signs believing it gives him leverage. What he's actually doing is handing us every asset he tried to protect. I asked Theodore if Brennan's attorney had reviewed the subordination clause. His attorney is Vincent Carr, a civil litigator out of Garden City. Competent man, real estate focus. He likely reviewed the transfer mechanics, but would have had no reason to cross-reference against a prior court order he didn't know existed. The clause is visible in the public record as of July 10th. It was not hidden from anyone. Brennan simply did not look. That distinction mattered. I had spent 30 years building structures that had to hold weight, and I understood the difference between concealment and negligence. We had not hidden anything. We had simply built our foundation before Brennan arrived with his own plans, and he had not checked what was already in the ground. Natalie called me at noon. Her voice was measured, but I knew her well enough to hear what moved underneath it, the tight control of a woman holding something heavy and refusing to let it shake her. "He came home for lunch," she said. "He was in a good mood. He made sandwiches." A short breath. He talked about the board meeting like it was going to be a formality, said the restructuring proposal was going to pass easily, that a few of the older members were already aligned. My chest pulled tight. Did he mention Harlan? Not by name. He said the votes are already there. He seemed very confident. A pause. "Dad," he kissed Lily on the forehead before he left. She was drawing at the kitchen table, and he kissed her forehead and told her she was going to have a very good future. I gripped the counter's edge. Brennan had looked at his daughter, his 6-year-old daughter, who called him Daddy, and had placed a paper crown on his head at her birthday party and seen insurance. And now he had put her name on a document he believed would protect himself, not her, wrapping his own survival in the shape of fatherhood. "Natalie," I said, keeping my voice level. "Are you all right?" "I'm angry," she said simply. "I'm very angry, and I'm going to stay that way until Thursday, and then I'm going to be done with it." That was her mother in her. Margaret had always converted grief into precision. Theodore confirmed at 3:47 p.m. that Brennan's trust transfer had been executed and notarized at a Meridian office. All personal assets, 4 properties, 2 brokerage accounts, and a 34% partnership interest in a Scottsdale commercial development valued at approximately $2.1 million were now formally subordinate to the prior court order. Lily's trust with Conrad as trustee absorbed them all under Idaho law. Brennan had handed us everything he was trying to protect, and he had done it willingly in front of a notary with his own signature. I went out to the back porch that evening and stood where I could see the Boise foothills going dark against the sky. 4 days until Thursday. The evidence was assembled. The federal warrants were prepared. The financial trail was documented. The medical file was recanted. The asset transfer was complete. Everything was in place. What remained was the hardest part, walking into that boardroom and watching the man smile at me across the table, not yet knowing that the ground beneath him was already gone. Before I take you into that boardroom, before I show you what was on that USB drive and what happened when the doors finally closed, drop a number in the comments. Comment 19 if you think Conrad was ready. Comment 7 if you think Brennan still had a way out. Because I need to know you are here for what comes next. Quick note: portions of this story include fictional elements built to serve the larger message. Names, places, and certain details are not drawn from any specific individuals, but what this story reveals about trust, family, and consequence. That part I stand behind completely. The Sterling Construction boardroom occupied the entire northwest corner of the fourth floor, with floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the Boise skyline, and beyond it, the pale brown ridge of the foothills. Margaret had always said that I built things so other people could see further. Standing at the elevator bank at 8:47 a.m. on July 19th, I thought about that. I had not slept more than 3 hours. The meeting was scheduled for 9 o'clock. I had arrived early deliberately, the way I always arrived to any site inspection, before the crew, before the noise, while the structure was still quiet enough to read. Natalie was already inside. I could see her through the glass partition, seated at the head of the long oak table, in a charcoal blazer, a legal pad in front of her, her pen moving steadily. She did not look up when I entered. She did not need to. I took my seat 2 chairs to her left. Within 10 minutes, the room filled. Sheldon Krause arrived at 8:52, CFO, 51 years old, 9 years at Sterling, a compact man with wire-rimmed glasses and the careful, unhurried movements of someone who had spent decades making himself invisible in rooms like this. He nodded at me. I nodded back. He sat directly across from Harlan Voss, which I noted. Harlan arrived at 8:55 carrying a leather portfolio and a cup of coffee from the cart in the hallway. He greeted 3 board members by first name, laughed at something one of them said near the window, and settled into his chair at the far end of the table with the ease of a man who considered this room his natural habitat. 22 years. He had sat in that chair through 3 recessions, 2 ownership transitions, and the year the Boise River flooded 2 of our project sites simultaneously. I had trusted that ease completely for 2 decades without question. I watched him open his portfolio and uncap his pen. Brennan walked in at 8:59, 1 minute before the hour, with the particular confidence of someone who had timed his entrance. He wore a charcoal suit, darker than Natalie's blazer, which I suspected was not accidental, and carried a slim presentation folder. He caught my eye as he moved to his seat, and he smiled. It was a full, unhurried smile, the kind that said he believed this morning was going to go exactly as he had planned it. I smiled back. 30 years of construction negotiations had taught me that the most useful thing a man can do in a difficult room is look like he has nowhere better to be. Natalie opened the meeting precisely at 9. She reviewed the agenda: quarterly financial report, capital allocation update, and a restructuring proposal submitted by Brennan Holt, Senior Financial Advisor, under Agenda Item 4. Standard procedure. She moved through the first 3 items with the efficiency of someone who had run these meetings for 2 years and intended to run them for 20 more. Then she called Item 4. Brennan rose. He connected his laptop to the presentation screen at the head of the room and opened with a slide titled Sterling Construction Strategic Realignment Initiative, Q3 2024. His delivery was polished, paced, and persuasive, the kind of presentation that had clearly been rehearsed more than once. He walked the board through projected revenue, softening in Idaho's public infrastructure sector, rising materials costs, and what he described as an opportunity to restructure Sterling's capital base through a strategic partnership with Meridian Pacific Capital. The Meridian Pacific relationship, Brennan said, advancing his slide, positions Sterling for long-term regional growth while reducing our exposure to single-state contract dependency. The proposed transaction values sterling at $340 million, with existing shareholders receiving a premium of approximately 18% above current book value. He made it sound like a gift. He spent 11 minutes on the financial case. Then he paused, clicked to a new slide, and his tone shifted subtle, almost clinical. Before the board votes, I want to raise a governance concern. He did not look at me when he said it. He looked at the board. Over the past several months, I've observed a pattern of interference in Sterling's strategic decision-making from a non-executive party whose formal role ended with his retirement in 2022. A pause. Conrad Whitfield has been involved in communications with external legal counsel, has accessed internal financial systems, and has attempted to influence ongoing board deliberations. I believe this constitutes a governance breach. 2 board members shifted in their seats. Harlan Voss did not move at all. Brennan advanced to the next slide. It displayed a summary of Dr. Walter Price's fabricated cognitive assessment reframed as an independent health evaluation, suggesting that Conrad Whitfield demonstrated early markers of executive cognitive decline and that his involvement in company matters should be formally reviewed. My hands flat on the table pressed down against the oak surface. The wood was solid and cool and did not give. Natalie's jaw tightened by a fraction, but she did not speak. Not yet. We had agreed on the sequence, and the sequence was not broken. Brennan looked at me then for the first time since he had begun speaking. The smile was smaller now, quieter, more certain. The smile of a man who believed the document on the screen behind him was the last word. I held his gaze. Then I pulled back my chair and I stood up. Every eye in the room came to me. "I'd like to respond to Agenda Item 4, I said. My voice came out exactly as I needed it to level unhurried the voice I had used on every job site where something had gone wrong, and the crew needed to know that someone in the room still knew what to do. Natalie looked at me. "The chair recognizes Conrad Whitfield." I reached into my jacket pocket. What I pulled from my jacket pocket was not a weapon, not a document, and not a phone. It was a small black USB drive, the kind that costs $12 at any office supply store in Boise. I held it between my thumb and forefinger for a moment, and I watched Brennan's smile do something interesting. It did not disappear. It thinned. The way ice thins over water in early March, when it still looks solid from a distance but will not hold weight anymore. I walked to the presentation screen at the head of the room. Brennan had not moved from his position beside the table. Natalie slid her laptop toward me without a word already connected to the display. I inserted the drive. "I want to address the board directly," I said. "What I'm about to present is documented, sourced, and has been reviewed by legal counsel. I'll ask that everyone remain seated until I've finished." I opened the first folder. The footage appeared on the screen at 21:34:07, time-stamped June 15, 2024. 18 seconds. The second-floor hallway of my home on Warm Springs Avenue captured on a professional gimbal camera with a directional microphone. Brennan and Celeste Pryor, Natalie's own executive assistant, in a moment that required no interpretation, and then Brennan's voice clear in the audio track. After the July meeting, she loses all signing authority. The restructuring locks her out. Lily is my insurance policy. The room did not erupt. It went the opposite direction, that specific airless quiet that descends when people hear something they cannot unhear and are still deciding what it means. Harlan Voss set his pen down. Sheldon Krause took off his glasses. Brennan said, "That audio has been manipulated." "It has not," I said. "The original file metadata is included in the documentation package. The recording was made on equipment owned by Patrick Odom, a licensed commercial videographer retained by Meredith Cole Events. The chain of custody has been preserved and is documented in the attachments." I opened the second folder. This is a financial trail reviewed by Ray Callum Sterling's head of corporate security and independently verified by Theodore Wynn, our legal counsel. The screen displayed Ray's traced transactions, 26 transfers each, just below the $10,000 reporting threshold, routed from a Sterling subsidiary account into Meridian Bridge Holdings. LC, a Delaware-registered shell entity. Total moved $2.3 million over 8 months. These funds were directed by Sheldon Krause under authorization codes that traced to Brennan Holt's executive access credentials. The Delaware entity has a single beneficial owner, a Nevada trust whose registered agent is linked to Meridian Pacific Capital, the same firm proposing today's acquisition. Sheldon Krause's hands were flat on the table, very still, the way a man goes, still, when he has just understood that the room he is in has changed completely. I opened the third folder. This is a sworn recantation signed July 14th, 2024, by Dr. Walter Price, the physician, whose assessment appeared on Mr. Holt's slide 11 minutes ago. I let the board read the first paragraph on screen. Dr. Price has confirmed under oath that the cognitive assessment was fabricated under coercion. Brennan Holt obtained a confidential malpractice settlement document from Dr. Price's past and used it as leverage to produce a false report. Dr. Price has agreed to testify as a federal witness. Brennan took a short, sharp breath, the kind that comes out when something hits before the body has time to prepare for it. I turned the laptop toward Natalie. Project Meridian. Natalie said, her voice steady and cold and completely controlled. These are internal emails recovered from Sterling's server. They document 14 months of coordination between Brennan Holt, Sheldon Krause, Harlan Voss, and a representative of Meridian Pacific Capital with the explicit goal of suppressing Sterling's valuation ahead of a discounted acquisition. The plan was initiated 4 months before my marriage. She said that last sentence without looking at Brennan. She said it the way you state a fact about whether clear final requiring no elaboration. I reached across and opened the fifth folder. Celeste Pryor's 7 audio recordings filled the room. Brennan's voice, Sheldon's voice, and Harlan Voss's voice captured across 4 separate meetings, discussing board vote manipulation, the Delaware fund routing, and the specific plan to use Dr. Price's fabricated assessment to remove Conrad Whitfield from any legal standing to contest the acquisition. Harlan Voss's face had gone the color of old concrete. I turned to face the board directly. On July 10th, with the knowledge of Judge Patricia Owens of the 4th District Court of Idaho, I established an irrevocable trust naming Lily Whitfield as sole primary beneficiary with myself as trustee. That trust contains a subordination clause publicly recorded that makes any subsequent asset transfer naming Lily as beneficiary subordinate to this prior order. I paused. 4 days ago, Brennan Holt transferred all personal assets, 4 properties, 2 brokerage accounts, and a 34% partnership stake in a Scottsdale development into a trust naming Lily as secondary beneficiary. Under Idaho Code and the prior court order, those assets are now consolidated under the irrevocable trust. They are protected. They belong to Lily. Brennan's chair scraped back. You can't. It is already done, Theodore Wynn said from his seat near the wall where he had been sitting quietly since 8:45. The transfer was executed, notarized, and recorded before your filing. The subordination clause was visible in the public record. Your attorney had access to it. The door at the far end of the boardroom opened. Agent Marcus Webb stepped in dark jacket, federal credentials clipped to his chest. 2 additional agents framing the doorway behind him. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. I'm going to ask that no one leave the room, Webb said. His eyes moved to the table. They did not go to Brennan first. They went to Harlan Voss. Harlan Voss did not run. That was the thing I would remember most, not Brennan's voice cracking, not Sheldon Krause pressing both palms flat against the table as if the floor beneath him had shifted. What I would carry with me was Harlan sitting completely still in his chair, his leather portfolio open in front of him, his coffee cup still warm beside his right hand, while Agent Marcus Webb crossed the room toward him. 22 years. Board retreats in Sun Valley. The fishing trip on the Salmon River the summer after Margaret died, when Harlan had driven 4 hours just to sit beside me and not say very much at all. His daughter's wedding where I had given a toast and meant every word of it. 22 years of a man I had believed was the most honest person in any room he entered. Webb stopped behind Harlan's chair. "Mr. Voss, I have a federal warrant for your arrest on charges of securities fraud, wire fraud, and conspiracy to violate the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States review process." He said it the way federal agents say things, factual, unhurried, without cruelty or theater. Harlan turned and looked at me. His eyes were dry. There was no rage in them, no desperation, only something old and tired. The expression of a man who had known for some time that a particular road ended here and had kept walking it anyway. "Conrad," he said. "Just my name, nothing else." My throat tightened. I did not look away from him. Webb's second agent moved to Sheldon Krauss, warrant in hand. Sheldon's glasses were still off, folded on the table in front of him. He nodded once, stood, and straightened his jacket with the mechanical precision of a man running on procedure because everything else had stopped working. Then Webb turned to Brennan. Brennan had risen from his chair at some point during Harlan's arrest, I had not seen exactly when, and was standing with his back almost to the window, the Boise skyline bright and indifferent behind him. His presentation folder was still in his hand. He was gripping it so hard the cover had bent. "Brennan Holt," Webb said. "Federal warrant, securities fraud, wire fraud, and conspiracy." Brennan looked at Natalie. Natalie looked back at him without flinching, without tears, without the smallest concession in her expression. She had her mother's eyes, the kind that could hold a hard truth steady without blinking. Brennan set the folder on the table. He set it down carefully, as if that one small act of neatness still mattered. Then he extended his wrists. The boardroom was quiet, not the airless quiet of shock, but something different. The quiet of a structure that has been under strain for a very long time, finally allowed to settle. I put my hand on the back of my chair and held it there. It was over. The charges were filed on July 23rd. Brennan Holt faced 4 federal counts: securities fraud, wire fraud, conspiracy to circumvent CFIUS, review, and fraudulent transfer. Sheldon Krauss entered a cooperation agreement with the Department of Justice within 72 hours of his arrest, confirming the full scope of the Meridian Pacific transaction and the Delaware fund routing. Harlan Voss retained private counsel and said nothing further. His silence, Theodore told me, was the loudest kind of confession. Gilbert and Loretta Holt learned of their son's arrest through Sophie Caldwell's article in the Boise Tribune. I did not call them. I had picked up the phone twice in the days that followed and set it back down both times because I did not know what I would say to 2 people who had raised a son they clearly loved and had no part in what he had done. Some distances, I decided, are not mine to close. Celeste Pryor received prosecutorial immunity in exchange for her testimony. She resigned from Sterling the following week. Natalie accepted her resignation without anger, which told me more about my daughter's character than anything I could have said about her myself. Sophie Caldwell published her investigation in the Boise Tribune on July 26th. The story ran above the fold and was picked up by 3 national outlets by the following morning. She called me the afternoon it published, not for comment, just to say the story had found the people it needed to reach. I thanked her and meant it. The CFIUS violation triggered a federal review of Meridian Pacific Capital's domestic investment portfolio. Victor Strand's firm was barred from completing any acquisition of a U.S. government contractor pending investigation. Sterling's board, reduced to 4 members following the arrests, voted unanimously to table the restructuring proposal indefinitely. Natalie remained CEO. My sister Donna called me the week after the charges were filed. She did not ask for details. She said, "You did right by that girl." And then she asked if I was eating properly, which was so entirely like her that I laughed for the first time in what felt like a very long time. That was Donna's particular gift. She always knew which question was the one that actually mattered. It was August before things felt anything close to still. I was sitting on the back porch on a Tuesday evening when Lily came through the screen door with a drawing she had made a house with a large tree beside it, and two figures standing underneath, one tall and one very small. "That's you," she said, pointing to the tall one. "And that's me." My chest pulled tight in the way it had been doing all summer, but this time there was nothing sharp in it, just fullness. The ordinary, almost unbearable fullness of loving someone small enough to still believe that a drawing can say everything that matters. I set the drawing on the table beside Margaret's photograph. They looked right together. I had spent 30 years building structures designed to hold weight bridges, roads, foundations, sunk deep enough to survive what came above them. I had understood that work as engineering. Sitting on that porch in the August light, watching Lily chase a grasshopper across the yard, with the focused intensity of someone for whom nothing else in the world currently existed, I understood it differently. The strongest thing I had ever built was not made of steel or concrete. It was made of the decision repeated every day for 60 years to tell the truth, even when the truth was costly. Even when it arrived at 8 in the morning on a phone call from someone you barely knew. Even when it meant sitting across a table from a man you had loved like a son and watching everything you had believed about him come apart. Lily caught the grasshopper. She held it up toward me with both hands, grinning. I laughed out loud, a real laugh, the kind that starts somewhere deep and arrives without permission. "Good catch," I said. She let it go. If this story taught me anything, and family stories, revenge rarely teach clean lessons, it is this: betrayal does not arrive wearing a mask. It arrives wearing a smile you already trust. I should have looked closer earlier. I was too certain that the people I built my life beside shared the values I built it on. That was my blindness. So let me say plainly, do not wait for the phone call. Pay attention to what people do when they believe no one is watching. I believe God does not promise us that the people we love will be worthy of that love. He only promises that the truth will hold if we are willing to carry it. This kind of reckoning does not feel like revenge when you are living it. It feels like choosing your daughter over your comfort, your granddaughter over your silence. My personal belief is simple: justice costs you something to wait for. Know that going in. These are the stories no one plans for, and everyone carries longer than they expect. And perhaps that is exactly why they matter. If this story stayed with you, leave a comment. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe because more stories like this one are coming. Thank you for staying until the end. Upcoming stories contain fictional elements built for reflection and education. If that is not what you are looking for, this is a good moment to find content that serves you better. We will be here when you return.